The rain began on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, it had not ceased. For 7 days, it fell in a soft, persistent curtain, drumming a gentle, ceaseless rhythm on the copper roof of the lighthouse and hissing against the thick, salt-cured glass of the lantern room. For Elias Thorne, the sound had at first been a comfort. It was the sound of isolation perfected, a soothing, universal shush that muffled the sharp edges of the world and left him entirely to his peaceful kingdom of stone and light. He had come to the St. Jude's Rock Lighthouse for this very reason. The quiet, the profound, unshakable solitude, miles from any shore, from any person, from any life but his own. He was a man who had found that the clamor of the world was a poor substitute for the honest roar of the sea. The lighthouse itself was old, a stone sentinel that had weathered a century of Atlantic furies. Its daily sounds and movements were a familiar companion, a language he had come to understand intimately. There was the steady, heavy thump-hiss-whir of the great Fresnel lens as it rotated in its bath of mercury, a sound like a sleeping giant's breath. There was the low groan of the old timbers in the living quarters as they expanded and contracted with the endless damp. There was the mournful sigh of the wind as it curled around the circular tower, sometimes a playful whistle, other times a baleful moan. These were the sounds of his solitude, the orchestra that played the soundtrack of his sleep. In his logbook, a thick, leather-bound volume, he didn't just record weather patterns and passing ships, he wrote to the lighthouse itself. "The sea was angry today, old friend," he might scrawl. "But you held fast, as you always do. Your light cut through the gloom and kept the darkness at bay." Tonight, however, a new instrument had joined the orchestra. It was a sound so faint, so utterly insignificant, that at first he was certain he had imagined it. He was at his small, sturdy oak desk, mending a fishing net, his fingers working the thick twine with practiced ease. The storm raged outside, a symphony of crashing waves and howling wind. And beneath it all he heard it. A thin, whispery thread of noise, like a handful of fine sand being dragged slowly across a pane of glass. It was a sound with texture, a dry, scraping quality that was utterly alien to the wet, percussive world of the storm. He paused, his hands still, his head cocked, listening with an intensity that only true silence can teach. He strained his ears, separating the layers of sound, the rain on the roof, the crash of water on the rocks below, the hum of the lamp far above. But there was nothing else. Only the storm and the sea and the steady heartbeat of the light. He dismissed it with a shake of his head. "Just the wind, Elias," he muttered aloud, his own voice sounding loud and foreign in the room. "The wind plays tricks in a place like this. It finds new cracks, new ways to sing its ugly songs." He went back to his net, but his fingers were slower now, his focus divided between the task at hand and the sounds of the tower. But it came again the next night. And the night after. It was no longer a single, fleeting sound, but a recurring one. A sibilant murmur, like voices in a distant room, the words always just beyond the reach of understanding. It seemed to rise not from the windows or the vents, but from the very stones of the tower itself, to drift on the damp, salty air like a foul mist. It began to take on a horrifying new quality. It seemed to respond to him. When he scraped his chair back from the table, the whisper would echo the sound, "shh chair." When he stirred his tea, the clink of the spoon was followed by a faint, metallic tssing. He started to test it, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. He tapped a rhythm on the table with his knuckles. Tap, 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 tap. And from the walls he heard a faint reply. SSS, SSS, SSS. He dropped his hands as if the table were red hot. This was not the wind. The wind was chaotic and mindless. This was intelligent. This was mimicry. This was something listening. His methodical search for the source became a frantic hunt. He checked every seal on the windows, stuffed rags into the smallest cracks, ran his hands along the cold, damp mortar of the stone walls, feeling for any vibration, any source for the maddening sound. There was nothing. The lighthouse remained a sealed stone drum, and yet, the sound was inside with him. On the seventh night, the nature of the whisper changed. It coalesced. Elias stood at the thick window of his small living quarters, watching the beam of the lantern cut its swath through the driving rain. Outside, there was nothing but a churning chaos of gray water and gray sky. The rain streaked down the glass, distorting the world into a weeping, unrecognizable blur. He listened, his breath held tight in his chest. The whisper was there, a soft, insidious chorus just beneath the roar of the wind. And for the first time, it seemed to be in time with the sweep of the great light above. As the brilliant beam passed over a dark, roiling patch of water to the north, the sound seemed to swell, focusing, almost taking the shape of a word, before fading as the light moved on. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, trying to see what the light was illuminating. And then he heard it. Clear as a voice on a still night, yet distorted, stretched, and waterlogged. E53 ass. It was his own name, sung on a single, sighing note. He stumbled back from the window, a cry catching in his throat. The feeling of being watched, a vague unease before, was now a suffocating certainty. He was not just being listened to. He was known. He stared back out at the sea, and his eyes were drawn again to that patch of water. It was strangely calm, a pocket of unnatural stillness in the midst of the tempest, and he could have sworn the beam of the lighthouse lingered there a moment longer than it should, as if it, too, were mesmerized by the spot. He felt a desperate need to get to the lamp, the source of the light, the one part of the tower that felt pure and untainted. He took a lantern and began to climb the winding iron staircase, his footsteps a loud, clanging echo in the narrow, suffocating space. The air grew warmer as he ascended, the immense heat from the giant lamp pressing down on him like a physical weight. With every step, the whisper grew louder, clearer. It was no longer a murmur but a chorus of distinct sibilant voices, weaving in and out of each other in a complex, rustling harmony. When he finally pushed open the heavy iron door to the lantern room, the sound washed over him. It was in the room with him. It seemed to cling to the curved glass of the lantern, to vibrate with the turning of the giant gears, to ride on the waves of heat emanating from the light itself. The great lens turned, as it always did, a magnificent creature of brass and faceted glass. But tonight, it did not feel like a machine. It felt like an eye. A single, colossal, all-seeing eye, and its gaze was the source of the whispers. The light swept its steady, silent path across the furious sea, and a chorus of whispers rose and fell with its every rotation. He pressed his ear to the cold, wet glass of the lantern room, looking down at the waves crashing against the rocks at the base of the lighthouse. The foam glowed a ghostly white under the beam, a churning, grasping hand reaching for the stone. And then the sound changed. The chaotic whispering sharpened, refined itself, and for a moment, it became almost musical. It was a sad, mournful tune sung in a language he did not know, yet somehow, he understood it. It was a song of the deep, of crushing pressure and eternal, starless darkness. It was a song of things lost to the sea, of sunken ships and drowned sailors, of immense, patient waiting. It was a song of grief. And to his horror, it evoked a memory he had long since buried. The tune was a twisted, minor-key version of a lullaby his mother used to sing to him as a boy, a lullaby he had not thought of in 30 years. The song promised peace. It promised an end to loneliness. It promised an end to the grief that had driven him to this rock in the first place. It promised sleep. Elias felt a strange, terrifying pull, a deep longing to understand the song, to give in to its sorrowful beauty, to answer its impossible call. His eyelids were heavy, his limbs felt like lead. The rhythmic sweep of the light, once a comfort, was now a hypnotic pendulum. Sweep, and the whisper swelled into song. Sweep, and it faded to a sigh. Sweep, and the sad, beautiful melody pulled at the very strings of his soul. His gaze was fixed on the patch of unnaturally calm water to the north. As the beam passed over it this time, he saw it. Or he thought he saw it. It was not clear, not a defined shape, but an impression under the surface. A suggestion of something vast and pale, something that moved with a slow, languid grace that defied the violence of the storm around it. It seemed to turn, to writhe in time with the music, a dancer in the deep. The pull to join it became physical. He felt his body swaying in time with the melody. His hand, as if with a will of its own, rose and reached for the heavy brass latch on the lantern room's storm window. He could feel the cool sea spray on his face, taste the salt on his lips. The song was a promise, and it was a promise he suddenly, desperately wanted to be kept. It was a flare of pain in his knuckles, scraped raw against the cold metal of the latch, that broke the spell. He snatched his hand back as if burned, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. The beautiful song instantly became a cacophony of hateful whispers in his ears. He scrambled back from the glass, his heart a frantic, trapped bird against his ribs. He knew, with a certainty that was more terrifying than any storm, that he was no longer alone on this rock. The solitude he had so desperately craved had been a vacuum, and something from the deep had rushed in to fill it. This ancient, patient thing had been singing its song into the storm for 100 years, waiting for a keeper lonely enough, sad enough, to finally listen. His retreat was a panicked, stumbling flight. He slammed the heavy iron door of the lantern room shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot. As the latch clicked home, he could have sworn he heard a sound from the other side, not of anger, but of disappointment. A collective, sorrowful sigh. He half fell down the winding stairs and barricaded himself in his living quarters, shoving his heavy sea chest against the door. But it was useless. The sound was no longer just from above. It was coming from below, seeping up through the thick stone floor, as if the very foundations of the lighthouse had become its instrument. Sleep did not come. How could it, when the very stones beneath his cot seemed to hum with that terrible, sibilant chorus? He lay there in the dark, curled into a tight ball, the wool blankets pulled over his head offering no protection. The mimicry was over. The whispers were no longer just sounds, they were words. His words. They whispered his deepest fears, his most private regrets, in a chilling, multi-voiced echo. "She never loved you, you know," they hissed, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "You ran away, Elias. You ran from her ghost, and you ran from your father's disappointment." A new voice, higher and thinner, like the cry of a gull, picked up the thread. "You think this solitude is strength? It is cowardice. You are a coward, hiding from a world that never wanted you." He clamped his hands over his ears, but the voices were inside his skull. They spoke of his mother's slow decline, replaying her final, wheezing breaths with a wet, gurgling accuracy that made him want to vomit. They mocked his failed attempts at a life on the mainland, the lost jobs, the friendships that withered from neglect. Every failure, every shame, every moment of weakness was dredged up from the depths of his memory and laid bare in the suffocating darkness of the room. The lighthouse, once his sanctuary, had become his confessor, and its penance was this endless, tormenting litany. The gray, joyless light of dawn finally filtered through the window. The storm had broken, and the rain had softened to a drizzle. With the diminished fury of the sea, the whispers receded, fading back into the threshold of hearing, a faint, static hiss that promised to return with the next storm. Exhausted, hollowed out, Elias knew he couldn't endure another night like that. There had to be an answer. Some other keeper must have heard it, felt it. Fueled by a desperate, fearful energy, he went to the small, damp storage room at the base of the tower. Here, packed in rotting wooden crates, were the archives, a century of keepers' logs. He pulled them out, the smell of mildew and salt and decaying paper filling the air. He worked with a feverish intensity, his hands stained with ink and grime as he pored over the spidery script of his predecessors. Most were mundane accounts of weather, maintenance, and passing ships. Replaced the wick in the primary lamp. Took on 3 barrels of oil from the supply tender. Clear skies for a week straight. Sea calm as a millpond. He felt a pang of jealousy for these men and their simple, untroubled lives. He searched for any mention of strange sounds, of unease, of a song in the storm. For hours he found nothing. He was ready to give up, to accept that he was the one who was mad, when he found it. It was a logbook from the winter of 1898. The keeper's name was Thomas Corbin, and his handwriting, at first, was a model of clarity and precision. But as the entries progressed through a particularly harsh November, the script began to change. It grew erratic, slanted, the letters digging into the page. November 12th, a terrible storm brews. The wind moans like a dying man. I hear a sound beneath it, a strange music. Elias's blood ran cold. He read on. November 15th, the music does not cease. It is a song from the deep. It calls to me. It knows my sorrows. It knows of Mary. The entries became shorter, more frantic. November 19th, I saw her today. In the water. A pale dancer in the calm spot beneath the light. She beckons. The song is so beautiful. Elias's hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold the book. He flipped to the final page. There was only one entry, scrawled diagonally across the page in a desperate, almost illegible hand. The ink was smeared, as if by water. November 21st, the light is its eye. The song is its voice. I cannot bear the loneliness any longer. She is waiting. I must go to her. I must silence the song. I will put out the... The sentence was unfinished. The rest of the page was blank. The official record stated that Keeper Thomas Corbin had been lost at sea, swept from the rocks by a rogue wave during a storm. Elias knew better. Corbin hadn't fallen. He had answered the call. He slammed the book shut, the sound echoing the gunshot of the lantern room door. He was not mad. He was not the first. This was real. A chilling realization settled over him. The light is its eye. The song is its voice. Corbin's words rang in his mind like a funeral bell. The light he so dutifully kept, the beacon that was meant to save lives, was the very thing that was damning him. It was the lighthouse's focus, its gaze, that gave the entity its power, that allowed it to sing its hypnotic, deadly song. He looked around the small room, at the tools hanging on the wall, heavy wrenches, a pry bar, a sledgehammer meant for breaking up coal. His duty, his sacred vow as a keeper, was to ensure the light never went out. It was the single, unbreakable rule of his profession. To extinguish the light was the ultimate sin. But what was a keeper to do when the light itself was the source of the darkness? A desperate, terrifying plan began to form in his mind. It was madness. It was a betrayal of everything he stood for. But it was the only thing he could think of. He had to blind the eye. He had to put out the light. He hefted the heavy sledgehammer, its weight both a burden and a comfort in his hands. He would wait for nightfall. He would wait for the song to begin again. And this time, he would not be the one who was silenced. The day was an agony of waiting. The drizzle petered out, and a heavy, oppressive stillness descended upon the rock. The sea, exhausted from its tantrum, settled into a flat, oily calm that seemed more menacing than the storm. Every nerve in Elias's body was screaming. The silence of the tower was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. He felt the weight of a century of keeper's vows pressing down on him. He walked through his duties like a ghost, his hands performing the tasks of cleaning and polishing by rote while his mind was miles away, rehearsing the violence to come. He went to the radio, his hand hovering over the switch to call the mainland, to report. What? A singing sea? A ghost in the light? They would think him mad. He turned away from it. He was alone in this, just as he had always been. He ate a can of cold beans, the metallic tang filling his mouth. He did not write in the logbook. What was there to say? Today, I will commit the greatest sin a keeper can. Today, I will murder my lighthouse. The sledgehammer leaned against the wall, a dark and silent promise. As the sun began its slow, bleeding descent towards the horizon, he could feel the pressure in the air begin to change. The sea was stirring again. The storm was coming back for its nightly performance. As the last sliver of sun vanished, the first tendrils of the storm arrived, as if summoned. The wind began to moan, and with it, the whispers returned. They were faint at first, inquisitive, like a predator sniffing the air. Elias picked up the sledgehammer. The iron head was cold and heavy, an anchor in the swirling chaos of his thoughts. He took a deep breath and opened the door to the stairwell. The climb began. With each upward step on the ringing iron stairs, the whispers grew stronger, more insistent. This time, they did not mock him. They pleaded. "Don't, Elias." They sighed, the voices of lost sailors and forgotten souls. "Don't break the beautiful light. We will be so lonely in the dark." A voice like his mother's, sweet and cloying, whispered from the shadows. "Is this what you've become, my son? A destroyer? I taught you better." He gritted his teeth, his knuckles white on the handle of the hammer. He felt a phantom weight on his shoulders, trying to press him back down, to make him turn around. He ignored it, focusing on the mechanical motion of his legs. Left foot. Right foot. The clanging of his boots was his war drum, a rhythm of defiance against their siren song. He was not their savior. He would be their end. He shoved open the door to the lantern room and was blasted by heat and sound. The song was already in full force, a deafeningly beautiful, soul-shattering aria of grief and longing. The great lens turned, its light seeming to scoop the song up from the sea and fling it into his very bones. He staggered, the sledgehammer feeling impossibly heavy. He looked out the glass, and he saw it clearly now. The pale shape in the water was no longer a mere suggestion. It had form. It was immense, a creature of bone-white flesh and countless, sinuous limbs that writhed in a slow, ecstatic dance in the patch of calm water. It had no face, but he felt its gaze upon him, a gaze of infinite hunger and patience. The voices screamed in his head. "Fool! You think you can fight the ocean? You are nothing! A speck of dust!" Then his father's voice, full of disappointment. "You couldn't even keep a simple light burning. You fail at everything." He saw the phantom shape of Thomas Corbin standing by the window, his face a mask of sorrow, shaking his head slowly. "Don't do it, brother," the apparition whispered. "It is better to join the song than to live in the silence. The light is its eye." Elias roared, his voice raw, screaming the words into the gale of sound. "The song is its voice." He had to hold on to that thought, that one piece of truth he had found in the archives. It was his shield. The creature in the water seemed to pulse, and the song intensified, the melody so beautiful it brought tears to his eyes, a promise of an end to all pain, all memory, all failure. He felt his resolve cracking, his grip on the hammer loosening. He was so tired. It would be so easy to just set the hammer down. So easy to open the window. To sleep. He saw his own reflection in the turning lens, a wild, haggard man with terror in his eyes. And behind his reflection, he saw the pale, dancing thing in the sea. He was looking at it through the eye. Corbin's final words echoed in his mind. "I will put out the—" "No!" Elias screamed, the sound swallowed by the music. He swung the sledgehammer back, all his fear, his grief, and his defiance pouring into the motion. He put his entire body into the swing, aiming for the heart of the magnificent, priceless, thousand-faceted lens. For a single, eternal moment, as the hammer arced through the air, the world held its breath. The rain began on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, it had not ceased. For 7 days, it fell in a soft, persistent curtain, drumming a gentle, ceaseless rhythm on the copper roof of the lighthouse and hissing against the thick, salt-cured glass of the lantern room. For Elias Thorne, the sound had at first been a comfort. It was the sound of isolation perfected, a soothing, universal shush that muffled the sharp edges of the world and left him entirely to his peaceful kingdom of stone and light. He had come to the St. Jude's Rock Lighthouse for this very reason. The quiet, the profound, unshakable solitude, miles from any shore, from any person, from any life but his own. He was a man who had found that the clamor of the world was a poor substitute for the honest roar of the sea. The lighthouse itself was old, a stone sentinel that had weathered a century of Atlantic furies. Its daily sounds and movements were a familiar companion, a language he had come to understand intimately. There was the steady, heavy thump hiss whir of the great Fresnel lens as it rotated in its bath of mercury, a sound like a sleeping giant's breath. There was the low groan of the old timbers in the living quarters as they expanded and contracted with the endless damp. There was the mournful sigh of the wind as it curled around the circular tower, sometimes a playful whistle, other times a baleful moan. These were the sounds of his solitude, the orchestra that played the soundtrack of his sleep. In his logbook, a thick, leather-bound volume, he didn't just record weather patterns and passing ships, he wrote to the lighthouse itself. "The sea was angry today, old friend," he might scrawl. "But you held fast, as you always do. Your light cut through the gloom and kept the darkness at bay." Tonight, however, a new instrument had joined the orchestra. It was a sound so faint, so utterly insignificant, that at first he was certain he had imagined it. He was at his small, sturdy oak desk, mending a fishing net, his fingers working the thick twine with practiced ease. The storm raged outside, a symphony of crashing waves and howling wind. And beneath it all he heard it. A thin, whispery thread of noise, like a handful of fine sand being dragged slowly across a pane of glass. It was a sound with texture, a dry, scraping quality that was utterly alien to the wet, percussive world of the storm. He paused, his hands still, his head cocked, listening with an intensity that only true silence can teach. He strained his ears, separating the layers of sound, the rain on the roof, the crash of water on the rocks below, the hum of the lamp far above. But there was nothing else. Only the storm and the sea and the steady heartbeat of the light. He dismissed it with a shake of his head. "Just the wind, Elias," he muttered aloud, his own voice sounding loud and foreign in the room. "The wind plays tricks in a place like this. It finds new cracks, new ways to sing its ugly songs.